Hello everyone and good afternoon. My name is Chris Hart and I work for Manchester University Press, and I'm delighted that you're all joining us for what promises to be an excellent armchair event. We're soon going to begin today's author talk with Jonathan, but before I jump in, I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So firstly, thank you to everyone who's tuned in and is watching this live and interactive armchair event, number 10 in the series. On your screen you should see an event dashboard containing question and chat options. The question option is for you to type questions throughout the talk, which Jonathan will hopefully get around to answering during the Q&A section at the end of the event. Please do ask questions, because for the events we've already done, I know from feedback with authors that they really enjoy that interactive element at the end of the event. The chat option is for you to raise any problems during the event, particularly technical problems, which I'll try and address as the event's going on. So as a brief introduction to today's author, Jonathan Chatwin is a travel writer and journalist. His essays and articles have been published by the South China Morning Post, the British Film Institute and the Los Angeles Review of Books, amongst other publications. He has lived in and travelled extensively in China, on which his current writing focuses. Jonathan is also the author of another MUP book, Anywhere Out of the World, which is a literary biography of the traveller and writer Bruce Chatwin. So needless to say, Manchester University Press is delighted to be the publisher of Long Peace Street, which critics have praised for its beautifully wrought combination of insights, observations and anecdotes, as well as fusing of genres. To read Long Peace Street is to immerse yourself in China's past and present, whilst walking beside an engaging and friendly guide in Jonathan. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jonathan, who will talk more about his book and go on from there. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome everybody to sunny Birmingham. We're going to take a stroll across Beijing today, and the book was born out of a walk that I did in 2016. It seems a very dim and distant time now, the summer of 2016. I did the walk in August 2016, and it was a walk of about 20 miles across the centre of Beijing, and this was the route that I took. I started out in the west of the city, just near where the sort of western hills start to rise out of the frying pan flatness of the city. I had an old iron and steel works called Shogun, which is now the headquarters of Beijing's Winter Olympics, which is theoretically supposed to happen 2 years from now. And I walked across the city over the course of 2 days, as I say, about 20 miles, ending up in its eastern suburbs. And from there, the road continues out into the sort of amorphous suburbia around Beijing, and then heads south from there. The city is symmetrical, as you can sort of see from this map that I've got up on the screen here. And I'll talk a little bit about how this incredibly straight street came to exist. It is an imposition on the imperial architecture and formation of the city. The reason I thought it would be a good walk to do and to write about was because it passes through some of the most historically significant places in China, but also along the way, sort of hidden stories crop up. I lived a couple of blocks south of Chang'anjie, Long Peace Street, when I lived in Beijing, and as I travelled along it, I'd often spot little hidden fragments of old China, and I thought the walk through the city would be a nice way of exploring the city's past. The name of the street, Chang'anjie, I translate that very literally as Long Peace Street. It's sometimes referred to as the Avenue of Eternal Peace, and its name comes from the original Chang'anjie, which was in Nanjing in the south, well, to the south of Beijing. Beijing means northern capital, Nanjing southern capital, and the name of that street was drawn from the old capital of the Han and Tang dynasty, Chang'an, which is present-day Xi'an. And its name to me had a certain irony, long peace, eternal peace. It's a place that has been the centre of all sorts of debates and protests over the years, and in particularly over the last century. And I thought that was an interesting aspect of its history that I'd like to explore in the book. At its centre, it cuts through a part of China that's probably the most famous, the most photographed, and that is Tiananmen Square. It divides Tiananmen Square from to the north, as you can see on this map, the Forbidden City. And this is sort of ground zero for China. It's the center for China. It's the point from which all distances are measured. I mean, it's probably the place that anybody who's been to China, day one, they'll probably wander down to Tiananmen. And I'll talk a little bit more. We'll walk together through the architecture that surrounds this very significant place. So to tell you a little bit of the history of the street, as I said, it was an imposition on the imperial pattern of Beijing. And the imperial pattern of Beijing was oriented around a north to south axis, which still exists. So you can see here, this is one of the maps from the book drawn by my wife. And you can see here that the buildings here are laid out along this north-south axis. And actually the northern part of this extends further than the map shows. This was the line on which the emperor's throne sat, facing south. And so this pattern, in a way, the east to west run of Long Peace Street is a conscious subversion of this. And it was put in place mainly after the victory in 1949 of the Chinese Communist Party. And they decided to reshape the city. There was a lot of debate about what they should do. At that point, the imperial pattern of the city, this walled medieval city, was still intact, more or less, with a few incursions into its shell. The debates as to how they should change it, what they should preserve, were fierce. And there were people who said, well, what we should do is we should build a new city. And this is a map of that proposed new city. You can see the old city with its lakes and palace in the middle of old Beijing, and then this imperial pattern here, again oriented around a north-south axis, but a modern design, which was the idea of basing the new administration for the Chinese Communist Party out in what was then farmland to the west of Beijing. This would have had the virtue of preserving much of the imperial architecture in the center. But ultimately, partly on the advice of Soviet advisors who were very ubiquitous at the time, it was decided that the new government should center themselves around the center of the old city. And so what they did was they refashioned much of the architecture around this central section of the city. And here's a map from 1914, which shows the way that the city used to look. And the two yellow lines show where the road used to run, and you can see that they're not quite symmetrical, they don't quite match up. And you probably also spot that what is now Tiananmen Square, which is this area here, is actually a sort of T-shape. There were walls all around it and ministries and archives to either side, and all of that has been razed since the communists took over in 1949. To the west here, we're going to start our journey just about here at the gate of New China, and behind this gate you can see these two lakes. Together they are Zhongnanhai, and some of you will know that name. It is the site of Communist Party power in China, and the sort of equivalent to China's White House, if you like. So this was what was there, and they got rid of much of it in order to facilitate the parades, which many people will have watched. This is from 1959. 700,000 people lined Long Peace Street to watch this grand military parade, marking the 10th anniversary of Communist Party rule in China. The other reason, and this is an apocryphal story possibly, I've never been able to find out for real, but one of the theories is that they made it so straight and so wide and got rid of so much of the architecture around it because their paranoia was such they wanted to be able to land a plane outside Zhongnanhai just in case a swift getaway from Beijing was needed. So this is 1959, and you can see at this point that the road is already very wide and reinforced with granite blocks in order to allow those planes to land that I mentioned. It had been built in the 50s not only to facilitate the parades, but also as a showcase for the so-called 10 great buildings of Beijing. And again, these were to commemorate the 10th anniversary. You can see here a little bit of the old imperial architecture. This is one of the 4 gates that it used to intersperse between the eastern and the western stretches of Chang'an, and they were all razed to much outcry, it must be said, by those people who saw the value and beauty in the old imperial architecture. As I say, Long Peace Street was intended as a showcase avenue. It became known as the #1 street of China, and along it were scattered some of these 10 great buildings built for the 1959 anniversary. And there's 2 pictures there of 2 of the most famous. They include as well Beijing Railway Station, the Military Museum, which is a little further to the west in Beijing. And here we see the National Museum and the Great Hall of the People, which face each other across Tiananmen Square. We're going to start our walk at, as I say, at Xinhuamen, which is the entrance to the Zhongnanhai compound where Mao Zedong lived for most of the time that he ruled China. I'm just going to read you a quote, sort of inspired my walk a little bit. Simone de Beauvoir, when she visited Beijing in the 1950s, in her book that she wrote as a result of that, which is called The Long March, she said, "To walk down a street is an immediate, irrecusable experience for which no hypothesis about a city, however ingenious, can be a substitute or as instructive." And that was a little bit of the inspiration behind my walk. And I hope we can capture a little bit of the irrecusable, immediate experience that she referenced as we take a stroll together along this fairly short stretch. We're going to walk from Xinhuamen to the old Imperial Observatory, which sits on a lone fragment of old city wall. So this is the entrance to the leadership compound at Zhongnanhai. It didn't used to be a gate, it was just a tower, and it was called the Precious Moon Tower. It was built by one of the emperors of the Qing dynasty for a homesick concubine from Xinjiang, the territory in China's northwest. She was a Muslim from Xinjiang, and he built it. And from the balcony of this tower, she would gaze south, where the emperor had also had built a mosque and a market to remind her of home. And it was during the reign of Yuan Shikai, who took over after the end of imperial rule in China in 1912. He moved into Zhongnanhai and set this up as a place. Previously, it had been an imperial garden attached to, but not part of, the Forbidden City. And he moved in and he turned this into his site of leadership, and his offices were there. And he opened it up as an entrance onto Long Peace Street. Part of the reason he chose Zhongnanhai was because from 1912 to 1924, the Forbidden City just next door was still occupied, and it was occupied by the last emperor. Many of you will have seen the film, the Bertolucci film, and it was a very perverse situation where in the Forbidden City you had an emperor in name only, emperor only of this little world that he commanded in the Forbidden City, and to the west you had Yuan ruling from this imperial park as it was. And after the communists took over in 1949 and in 1950, they co-opted this area as the sort of headquarters, and it's tricky territory. If you walk down here, you'll already had your passport checked once at least, and there always are milling around the entrance here, plainclothes policemen and security. It's been a site of protest over the years, and is closely guarded. So we're going to walk from here. We're going to head east down Long Peace Street, just a little way, and from here you can actually already see the next big landmark, which is Tiananmen itself, the Gate of Heavenly Peace. This leads you through, to go through those archways into the Forbidden City, and it was from the balcony here where Mao Zedong, October 1st, 1949, declared that the Chinese people have stood up, and announced the founding of the People's Republic of China. And you can see his portrait there. Gazing south from here, to get onto the square, by the way, we'll have passed through under some very hot, dark underpasses, certainly hot in August, through more security checks, your bag checked, your passport checked again, and emerge in blinking into the light here on Tiananmen Square. If we look south from this point, you'll see the monument to the People's Heroes. Now, this was built in the 1950s as well, and contrarily sort of prefers the vertical. Beijing, a famously low-rise city for most of its history. Much of its architecture is single-story, and there's only one real viewpoint in the city, which is a hill that was constructed from the soil, excavated from the Forbidden City's moat and the lakes that I was just talking about at Zhongnanhai. So in a way, already this is a subversion of the imperial tradition of the city. It also was the subject of lots of debate within the Communist Party as to what form it should take, and that's why it sort of ended up as something slightly bland and amorphous. Around the bottom, you can see these marble bas-reliefs, which I'll talk more about shortly. Significant also is the security around it. You can't approach the base, and we'll talk about why that is. It's a vast space, Tiananmen Square, and the architect Liang Sicheng talked about it feeling like a man falling into a desert. It still feels enormous, although it is not anymore the largest public square in the world. That honour belongs to another Chinese city, Dalian, which is up in the northeast, and they have a square there called Sea of Stars, which is now the largest in the world. South from the monument to the People's Heroes is the mausoleum where Mao himself resides, or possibly a wax replica. When he died in 1976, the doctors, there's an account from his personal physician that there was a lot of panic because the physicians attending him didn't quite know how to preserve the body effectively. So they injected him with litres and litres of formaldehyde, which swelled his body and his face to unrecognisable proportions. And he was then massaged back into some sort of recognisable form. They also, at that point, so his physician says, built a wax replica of him. And many people think this is what you see when you filter through the crowds to get in to the mausoleum and approach the crystal coffin. You don't get too close. I think the likelihood is from his appearance that it is the waxwork rather than the real great helmsman that you see. This was built on that north-south axis that I was referencing. So very consciously on that line, that imperial line of the city. And I'm just going to read a short extract from the book about this section of our walk and about the way in which the imperial pattern of the city was subverted and the intentionality behind that. So this is from the section on Tiananmen. Autocracies like to tidy the mess of history and human behaviour into order, and since the founding of the People's Republic, the traditional layout of the space in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace has been raised and rebuilt in order to ensure that it tells just one story. In undertaking this refashioning, scale and symbolism were of paramount concern. The trees which lined the so-called 1,000-step corridor which joined the front gate with the Gate of Heavenly Peace, and which we see in this photo here. They were uprooted and granite slabs laid in their place to make a plaza of nearly 450,000 square metres. The section of Long Peace Street, which runs north of the square, was widened and reinforced to convey the National Day Parade, and in response to the early paranoid thinking of the CCP to allow aeroplanes to land should a swift getaway be necessary. When the Great Hall of the People was built in 1958 on the western side of the square, its construction used an almost inconceivable amount of raw materials, 127,700 cubic metres of reinforced concrete, 24,000 square meters of marble, and 27,000 square meters of granite. The same principle was applied to the construction of Maos Mausoleum, in which hundreds of thousands of volunteers from across China helped during the rapid 6-month construction. The obsession with scale continues today when the National Museum opposite the Great Hall of the People was being refurbished for its reopening in 2011. One of those employed in consulting on the redesign was called up first with a query as to the square footage of the Louvre, and then to that of the British Museum, all to make sure that Beijing's was bigger. The 8 carved marble panels, which are oriented around the base of the Monument to the People's Heroes, and here is one of them, depict scenes of protest and rebellion, which outline the founding myth that the square and its surrounding buildings represent one of a linear struggle against the old order and the impositions of foreign powers, in which the Chinese Communist Party emerge as heroes and liberators. The fight against imperialism in the First Opium War, the fight against feudalism in the revolution against the Qing dynasty of 1911, the fight against the nationalists in the Civil War, these and other similarly distinct historical moments are arranged in cartoon book order around the base of the monument. It is the telling of history backwards, trying to join the dots to show the inevitability of China's current political situation. A permanent exhibition at the National Museum expands on this pictorial representation, telling of the explorations made by the Chinese people from all walks of life who, after being reduced to a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society since the Opium War of 1840, rose in resistance against humiliation and misery and tried in every way possible to rejuvenate the nation. That's a quote. The CCP are, of course, the secret ingredient in finally overcoming all the humiliation and misery. It was under their leadership we learned that, quote, all ethnic groups joined forces to achieve national independence and liberation. Mao, now reclining in his crystal coffin at the centre of the square, looms large in the story of this national rebirth, of course. When the museum first opened, visitors to the main exhibition were greeted by an enormous bronze head of the great helmsman. Yet particularly in a place as dense with history as this, there is always another narrative waiting quietly to erupt and contradict the official version. Looking at Mao's portrait on the Gate of Heavenly Peace, indubitably the most famous picture in China, one might recall that his was not the first portrait to hang thus. An image of Sun Yat-sen had been mounted there in 1929, and a picture of nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, painted on welded scrap metal, had been positioned on the platform in the 1940s. Photos from the 1930s show a clock declaring Republican time on the balcony balustrade. Looking at the images of protest and popular uprising around the base of the Monument to the People's Heroes, one might remember the protests of 1989 or 1976, and mentioned by the carvings or the monument's adjacent plaque, but perhaps tacitly acknowledged by the perimeter fence which now surrounds it and the uniformed guard at its base. In 1976, it had been piled with wreaths to commemorate the death of Premier Zhou Enlai. In 1989, the monument became a platform from which leaders of the movement addressed the crowd, and banners had been tied around its base. The people will not forget 1989, read one. Or one might turn to thinking of the famous story of the workmen who, in the early days of the fledgling republic, were sent to take down the sign on the great Qing gate that we just saw, which stood where Mao's mausoleum was later to be built. When they got into the loft of the great Qing gate, what did they find? Only that their predecessors, sent to do the same job at the end of the Ming dynasty, had preserved the old sign, which read Great Ming Gate, just in case, for who knows what the long years will bring. We'll set off then from Tiananmen Square and we'll walk a little further east through the city. And doing so, the first major landmark we'll come across is this, the Beijing Hotel, now much expanded since this photo was taken. And you can see here the trams that used to run along in Republican era Beijing along Chang'an. The block that was added in the 1970s caused a bit of a problem. You can see how flat the city is here, and you can see here the sort of shadows of the Western Hills way out in the west. And when they built the 1974 wing, quite quickly it was realized that from one of its balconies you could see into Zhongnanhai, not only see into it, but potentially draw a sniper bead from the balcony. So a screen was hastily added on the edge of the Forbidden City to stop that from being possible. To the south of it run the remains of Beijing's legation quarter, some fortifications here from around 1928. These were beefed up enormously after the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, when the legation quarter, the home of foreign diplomats in China and in Beijing, was laid siege to. Much of this is now being razed. There's a few fragments of the old legation quarter which run along a ribbon of alleyway just running east from Tiananmen Square. But in these days it was a place of refuge, a place where, as Edgar Snow, the journalist, said, that the Europeans had created their own Never Never Land, trying to emulate their lives at home. And it was considered unusual and perhaps a little strange to live outside the legation quarter as a European in the first decades of the 20th century. But one person who did is George Ernest Morrison. And I mention him because as we walk east along Long Peace Street, the next road that we pass, next major intersection we pass, is with a road which was once called Morrison Street. Now, Morrison was the Peking correspondent for the London Times in the early period of the 20th century. He became famous as the man who died twice, because during the Boxer Rebellion, acting on some faulty information, his own newspaper, the London Times, published a lengthy death notice for him, because he had been reported to have been killed in the fighting. He wasn't dead. Claude MacDonald, who was also a prominent figure at the time, was also reported dead. He had actually just been slightly injured, Morrison had, but became famous partly as a result of that story. He survived and he moved into this house, which is on a street now known as one of Beijing's premier shopping streets, Wangfujing, but was known mainly by the European community as Morrison Street, although the name was transliterated into Chinese. And he became more famous, certainly within China, because when he retired as a correspondent, he became an advisor to Yuan Shikai, the then leader of the Republic, and had great intentions in doing so, which were ultimately dashed. He had a wonderful library here, which was preserved for many years and eventually shipped to Japan. Unfortunately, his life had a sad end. He went to Europe to help China negotiate in what for them was the disastrous Versailles Conference of 1919. He'd been suffering from illness for a while and ended up dying in retiring to Sidmouth in England on the south coast to recuperate, but ultimately died far from his much loved Peking home. There's a wonderful article about this by Claire Roberts, which is referenced there at the bottom of the slide. The house, there is no remnant of the house there anymore, and what was left of it was destroyed in advance of the 2008 Olympic Games in order to build an Adidas shop, depressingly. We'll carry on a little further east. We're approaching the end of our journey here. And these rainbows, surprisingly colourful, and at night they're lit up with neon, and these were built to commemorate the handing back of Hong Kong to Chinese rule in 1997. And you can just see on the edge of this, to the right of this photo, our final destination on our walk along Chang'an Avenue, the Imperial Observatory, which is 14 meters high on a fragment of the old city wall and one of the last fragments that remains. Beijing's city walls were famous and much remarked upon by people who visited. And here's a picture of it, and you can see the moat which ran in places more of a stagnant ditch, really. And the walls lasted until the 1950s, albeit with some incisions into their shell. Walls really made up the fabric of the city. The Forbidden City was behind its own high wall. Around that was the wall of the Imperial City. Around that was the wall of the inner city. And to the south of that was obviously the inner city implies an outer city, which was where, when the Qing dynasty, the Manchus of the Qing, took control, they pushed the Chinese out to the outer city, an oblong-shaped area to the south of Old Beijing. And so the names of the cities became the Tartar City and the Chinese City. The wall of the outer city, the Chinese city, had pretty much gone by the late 1950s, and the inner city, the Tartar City wall, remained intact until the subway was being built in Beijing. And in order to build the subway, they used a method called cut and cover, where they would destroy whatever was on the surface and dig a ditch, and that's where the subway would run. And it was decided that rather than destroying houses, they would instead destroy the wall. And so by the end of the 1960s, the vast majority of the wall had entirely disappeared. When the communists had taken over in 1949, one plan for the city had come up with the idea of preserving the walls, putting openings to let traffic through, and then turning them into a sort of public park with tea houses in the gates, in the corners and the gates, which seems like some sort of utopian fantasy now, that you might be able to sort of walk up above the city and have a pot of tea on Beijing's old city wall. The observatory preserves an old fragment of it, and you can see a little stretch of it as it once was in this photo here. And the observatory is, if you have a chance to visit Beijing, a wonderful place to visit. It is a hidden sort of lone fragment of old China and old Beijing. The instruments that exist there today, and here's a more modern picture of them, have an interesting heritage, for they were designed not by a Chinese astronomer, but by a Flemish Jesuit missionary named Ferdinand Verbiest. And he won a sort of astronomy off with the director of the observatory. They were asked to predict certain important celestial events, and Verbiest got it right. Obviously, knowing what the celestial bodies were going to do, predicting them accurately was a key part of being a good imperial ruler. And so Verbiest's expertise was very helpful to the Kangxi Emperor, and he built these, designed these instruments, which sit atop the plinth in the late 17th century, and have been there mostly since then, although they were pilfered by foreign forces after the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, and it took a little while to get them returned, but they sit there still today. And from there you can look back along the line of the road that we've walked, back along Chang'anjie, to see and imagine what would have once been there. Looking north, the old imperial examination halls, ranks of these single-story, almost huts where the imperial examinations would have been taken, the old legation quarter, the ministries, the archives, and of course, further off in the distance, the walls themselves. And I'm just going to read a little extract and finish with a little extract from a book that I very much like about Beijing, written in the late 1910s by Juliet Bredon, who was Robert Hart's niece. She wrote a whole book on the architecture of the city, and came up to this spot where we're standing now upon the wall of the Imperial Observatory, and looked out over the city, over old Beijing. And this is what she wrote. The violet masses of the hills, which form so conspicuous a background in all views of Peking that they soon assume the aspect of loved and familiar friends, stand out sharply against the fiery sky. As the light fades, their outlines soften. They seem to withdraw little by little, almost regretfully, into the shadows. Gradually, one by one, the monuments of the city, the palaces, the coal hill, the temples, follow their example, fading away in a soft glow of light until, last of all, the gate towers and the walls themselves dissolve into greyness, and it is dark. So that's the end of our walk. I carried on a little bit further, but to the east, much of the city is new. You enter the new central business district with its skyscrapers and shopping malls. So I thought we'd stop there with that evocative fragment of old Beijing. And I'll answer some questions if there are some. So I think Chris did talk about how. Hi, Chris.
Yeah, how you doing? Yeah, I thought that was an excellent talk. It was nice to escape the bricks and mortar of my own home for the best part of half an hour there. I enjoyed that a lot.
Good.
In terms of, so if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to raise them, which Jonathan will get on to answering now. But in terms of, I've got a few questions to lead in. What inspired you to write the book, in terms of any literary inspirations or events that happened?
I mean, my background is the academic study of travel writing to a great extent, and as you mentioned, I wrote a book about Bruce Chatwin, the great British traveller writer and novelist. So I've always been interested in explorations of culture that are founded in travel and movement. China is such a vast country that, and there are some wonderful travel books about China, but China is such a vast country in terms of its history and geography that it seemed to me, as a non-specialist, that in order to get to grips with it, I needed to take a more limited approach. So the idea was taking this 20-mile stretch of a very significant road would be a manageable way of exploring the history. And I also love the travel writing of the 1930s from China and Beijing in particular, and the way it captures a sort of vanished era. And I think it's important for that tradition to carry on, for people to write their experiences down of these places. Especially China is changing so very fast, and you know, even since 2016, as I said at the beginning of the talk, that seems a dim and distant era. And all sorts of things have changed in our world since then. So yeah, that was a big part of the inspiration, I would say.
Okay, so you touched on there that China, you said, is moving very fast, and your talk obviously talks quite a bit about the past, the China past, and how that's you can see that in the built environment that you walk through. I'm interested in what good bits do you think that China is losing from its past and its rush to modernise?
I think, talking architecturally, a huge amount has been lost. There are signs that perhaps the heritage is starting to be taken a little bit more seriously. So in Beijing, for years and years, the destruction of the old Hutong and Seheyuan, the houses, the courtyard houses that sat along these narrow alleyways, they were destroyed in their tens of thousands. That has stopped to a great extent, and they are preserving. They've said that they're going to preserve the patch of them that remains in the sort of northwest of the city. The trouble is that what they're doing is, in my view, turning it into a slightly Disneyfied version of sort of what a Qing dynasty Hutong would have once looked like. So it's a tricky balance that they're trying to strike, and I am not convinced that it's always entirely successful, but it is at least they have at least stopped the destruction of much of what was being torn down at quite a rapid rate. And I think they understand now that there's a commercial appeal to this architecture as well. So the Hutong now are, it's where you go as a tourist in Beijing, and there's coffee shops and little bars and things lining them. Aimed mainly at now the domestic Chinese market. So I think that the government have discovered that these are quite a lucrative place to develop in a sort of faux traditional style. So it's not it's not universally good news, but the pattern of just destroying it and building a shopping mall has at least slowed, if not completely stopped.
Okay, I've got a question from Ian here. So he's asked, are there plans for a north-south journey? And I'll just add to that, if there are, and from your experiences obviously of living in China, what would that look like? Would that look different from the journey described in Long Peace Street?
Yeah, I mean, the north-south axis is the imperial axis, so it retains its central significance in the city. So the stories that are associated with it are those of the imperial past to a great extent. It's very hard to do the north-south walk because much of it is through areas that are the Forbidden City, which is walled off. And actually, you can't even get in through the northern entrance of the Forbidden City anymore. Everyone's filtered in through the south. So I mean, and that pattern is replicated in other Chinese cities. So that north-south axis, if you go to many Chinese cities, both the old axis, Guangzhou is a good example of this. They have an old imperial north-south axis, and then they have a new one which they've built with some very glossy, tall skyscrapers along it. So that still remains a very important kind of orientation and design principle for China cities, and that goes way, way back in terms of its influence. And people have talked about other walks, other roads that are significant, and there's Nanjing Road in Shanghai, for example, which should be another one. But I think it'll be, at the moment, the prospects of me getting back to China are pretty slender. I think my obviously visa at the moment is not much good. So I think that might have to wait a little while at the moment.
Okay, so I've got a question from James. So James obviously has commented that terrific images in the book, but could you say more about how you did your photo research? So he's made the comment that it seems especially important for a book focused on place. Yeah,
I mean, the great thing about Beijing in the 20th century, it was much photographed. So we have a good visual archive of the city, certainly sort of post 1900, that's true. And there's a wonderful archive which many people will know called Historical Photographs of China, which is overseen by Robert Bickers at the University of Bristol. And you'll have seen many of the photos here are drawn from that archive, which consolidates lots of individual archives which exist. And yeah, I think the visual aspect of it was really important to me, to conjure a sense of the place, both the contemporary city and the old city, that people could really picture and sort of, if they hadn't visited Beijing or China before, would be able to see in their mind's eye. So when I walked the street across the course of 2 days, and I took lots and lots of photos of really banal little things as I went along, just in order as a sort of visual record of the journey that I took, and I returned to those many times as I was in the process of writing the book. But if you haven't yet checked out the Historical Photos of China archive, it's a good way, especially during present confinement, it's a good way of whiling away a few hours looking at some wonderful photos of not just Beijing but China from the early to mid 20th century.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Sarah's asked, did you look what was beneath Long Peace Street? Any investigations or observations on the underground city?
I didn't do, so yeah, there are these tunnels which, when I talked about Mao's body being pumped full of formaldehyde, apparently when they were doing that, they took him down into these tunnels which were built during the paranoia about potential nuclear attack on Beijing. I didn't explore much of that in the book. One interesting aspect of it is that at the end of the walk, so when I was approaching the subway station, which was my destination, Chang'an actually does disappear underground. The sort of the road, the multi-lane highway, goes over an overpass, and you as a pedestrian sink underneath the city. And this I found was where many of Beijing's taxi drivers go for their afternoon sleep. Sort of lines of Beijing taxis there with lolling drivers with their feet sticking out the door, and also it was a place where many of Beijing's homeless population were living. And I saw a number of them. I went back to that site a few times. This underpass. And of course, the other thing that is under the city is the subway, and it's subway line 1 that I trace the route of, which is the sort of original subway line that runs from west to east, and has still, if you travel on it, a sort of flavour of the sort of late 60s, early 70s China to it.
Thanks, Jonathan. Got a question from Carola. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. How were you received in Beijing? How were the local people? Just talk about how you received in terms of helpfulness. Were they interested in what you were doing in terms of your study of the street?
Yeah. I mean, what was really nice, I mean, Chinese people are incredibly welcoming and friendly in my experience, and I lived there for a period of time, both in Beijing and Shanghai, and made many friends, and still have many friends there. In terms of the project, it was greeted with a bit of a mixed reception. I mean, there was a bemused kind of look when I told them about the walk, in particular the fact that I was doing it in August. So if anyone who hasn't been to China in the summer, it's swelteringly hot in Beijing in August. I think on the days that I did the walk, it was sort of 32, 33 degrees, incredibly humid. So not really great sort of flaneuring weather. So a lot of people I spoke to on the route, and I explained what I was doing, did look at me with a slightly confused manner. I mean, I like walking in Beijing. I find for me, it was my favorite method of getting around, but certainly that did present its challenges. But what's been nice since I finished the book, and I was back in China last summer doing some talks, traveling around a bit, and people were generally very positive about the idea of me kind of exploring some of these stories. And I knew people who lived very close to some of the sites that I wrote about who had no idea about the history. And of course, history in China is a contested, I can reference that in the passage that I read, the architectural history as well is a contested area. There's lots of politics kind of swirling around the stories of the places that I walked through. So on the whole, it was very well received, although, as you know, Chris, it was tricky to get the book in to China. I mean, I was there for about a month, and getting copies past an increasingly draconian sort of state-owned enterprise system, which restricts imports of English language books, was pretty tricky. So unfortunately, one of the places that you could buy it, which was the Beijing Bookworm sort of institution in Beijing, is now no longer. So unfortunately, for the moment, it might be tricky to pick a copy up in Beijing, I think.
Okay, thank you. Sad lament there. So I want to ask the significance of architecture. This is from Adam, sorry, I should say. The significance of architecture and urban design in China continue to this day. Do you have any thoughts about I think it's the Zhong'an project and the policy objective of limiting Beijing's growth? What impact do you think this will have on the life of the city and its physical development? Yeah, so that's a really great question. So Zhong'an is a new city, very much the pet project of Xi Jinping, and it's going to be built out to the southwest of Beijing. And the idea is it's going to be part of a bigger project which will sort of unite. It's called Jingjinji, so Beijing, Tianjin, which is a city to the southeast, and then the rest of Hebei province, which it sits in amongst. And the idea is to move some of the capital functions, some of the non-capital functions out to Xiong'an and to Tongzhou to the east, and kind of preserve Beijing and limit its population. And that's been happening. I didn't reference that in an earlier answer, and probably should have when I talked about the way that the city was changing. And one of the things that's been happening over the last few years is a number of the sort of poorer migrant population have been kicked out of the city, the housing where they lived being demolished, the markets where they trade being demolished, the shops and restaurants that they run have been shut. And the word you hear bandied around a lot about what Beijing they want Beijing to become is a civilized city. And of course, that is partly code for getting rid of this poor migrant population. And I think to answer the second part of the question, I think that is what is being lost, which is the culture of the city is being
homogenized, and an enormous amount is being lost by getting rid of those people. And there are unanswered questions as well. You know, these people universally did the jobs that people with Beijing residency didn't want to do. So part of the question is who's going to do those jobs once they've all left. But you know, part of the culture of the city were those little hole-in-the-wall shops and restaurants run very often by people who were not native Beijingers, and many of those, unfortunately, have been lost over the last few years.
Thanks, Jonathan. I've got one final question. It's one of my questions, and it's asked all authors. What next? So I know that we've got a paperback edition of Long Peace Street coming out early next year. But you spoke about your history with regards to travel writing, your areas of study. Do you have any plans to take what you've done with Long Peace Street and transfer this to another city, another part of China? We're interested to hear that.
Yeah, so last summer when I was back, I mean, the trouble is since then, you know, COVID-19 has slightly come to dominate all of the China narratives we're hearing, slightly depressingly, it has to be said. And my plan was that last summer I retraced a journey which Deng Xiaoping had taken in China, so a very famous journey that he made in 1992 called the Southern Tour, where he was trying to shore up the opening of China to the West and its economic reform, and he set out on his private train around the south of China for a month-long journey, which forced the new leadership back in Beijing to change tack to a great extent. So I spent much of last summer again in sweltering heat, and it's even hotter in the south in the summer than it is up in Beijing, traveling around retracing that journey, and I've been working on that project, slightly more historically focused, slightly more focused on the journey that he took rather than the journey that I took. So we'll see. At the moment, I'm slightly waiting for the coronavirus to play out a little bit, and obviously, as I sort of referenced, it is a shame that the narrative gets reduced to China narratives often do get reduced to these single stories. There's such a richness to China's history, and I think it's increasingly important that people around the world have a good understanding of China's history. So I hope that my book project can perhaps contribute to that. But as I say, unfortunately, it's nice to have a stroll back through Beijing, because I suspect it may be a little while till I'm able to get there myself in person.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. So I think it's probably a good opportunity to wrap up this event. We've lasted an hour without my kids bursting into the room and trying to hijack the event. So very pleased about that. So I just want to thank everyone who's attended, but also particularly you, Jonathan, for giving up your time and participating and giving this excellent talk. And I think your answers have been great as well. Very good. So anyone who'd like to get hold of a copy of Long Peace Street, an email will follow tomorrow, which will offer a 50% discount on all orders. So thanks everyone. And if you're interested in, so if you enjoyed this event and you're interested in others, we've got a series of armchair events extending through May and possibly into June. So please do look at our social media and our website for more information. So until next time, stay safe and keep well. And thank you again, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, and bye-bye, everyone.